Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter on Substack. You can subscribe to Cutting Through at mitchellplitnick.substack.com, where you can also donate to support this work. And if you find this valuable, please like and share Cutting Through with your friends and contacts and encourage them to donate in support so that this work can continue. Today, um, I felt a great need to talk about Ukraine and the situation with with Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow, and how that is all not coming together. The Trump administration has now offered a take it or leave it peace plan that Ukraine has virtually no choice but to leave, despite the fact that um, allowing the United States to abandon them means that Ukraine is in a much worse position to continue fighting off Russian aggression. People like myself advocated diplomacy long before even the Russian invasion, and certainly when the Russian invasion was looking imminent in 2021 and when it actually started in 2022. The notion that the sort of half-hearted military response of the Biden administration was going to resolve the problem struck me as insane then, and it strikes me as insane now, not least because um, it counted on a long-term conflict that eventually would wear down Russian resources, combined with sanctions and things of that nature. Um, and as Biden kept repeating, we're in it for the long haul, except he really couldn't make that promise. And, here we are in 2025, just as many of us predicted, watching Donald Trump essentially surrender Ukraine to Moscow. There were opportunities for diplomacy. For one thing, I mean, even after the invasion and unrecognized and unrecognizable annexation of Crimea back in 2014, there were things that could have been done. There were ways that this could have been approached, some carrots and sticks, and really try to really have an attempt to work things out between Russia and the West. And there were some attempts, in fairness. There were, towards the end of the Obama administration, some efforts, some attempts at an agreement, the Minsk II agreement. There were efforts to work things out, but they were half-hearted at best, and they were never very realistic. And it was never very clear that the Ukrainian government was fully on board with them. Ukraine had its own internal issues beyond the Russian occupation of both Crimea and some of the southeastern oblasts, particularly the Donbass region. The sort of low level conflict that kept going on through there was not one that international diplomacy paid, in my view, sufficient attention to, and that came back to bite us all when it became clear to Putin, to Vladimir Putin, that Donald Trump and his version of the American right wing were now key players on the global stage. And I also think that combined with with Putin's mistaken assessment of Joe Biden, that led to the 2022 invasion, where I do think he miscalculated and thought that Biden would not respond in any significant way, except perhaps to, to make sanctions a little bit harsher, or something of that nature. Various condemnations, various expulsions from international fora, whatever was left, although Russia had been kicked out of most of them by then. He was wrong, but he wasn't entirely wrong, because Biden was not willing to actually support Ukraine fully, and we provided a great deal of weapons. The truth is, though, that the greatest victories that Ukraine has won, it more or less won by itself, because the greatest victories that Ukraine has won in this war were at the beginning. The plan was there was this massive buildup of Russian forces, and Putin believed that he was going to be able to do a lightning strike into Ukraine and topple the Kyiv government within days, maybe weeks. And Ukraine fought them off, and that was really before the bulk of any Western aid or support had reached Ukraine. So that was where the really big victory was. And again, that was a real opportunity for diplomacy because Putin had been beaten back. His goal of toppling the government in Kiev and presumably either occupying even more of Ukraine or perhaps installing a more friendly one, more pro-Russian government that would be answerable to Moscow. That plan was pretty much done, pretty much fell by the wayside after Ukraine beat them back. But we had this situation where almost 20% of Ukraine has been occupied ever since. And while Ukraine has liberated some, and then Russia takes some back, and Ukraine captures some other territory, and Russia takes some back there, and Russia, maybe advances, and Ukraine manages to beat them back to older lines. It's been around 18 to 20% of the Ukrainian territory since the Russian invasion, and with just little changes here and there. And the truth is, we can talk all we want about the long-term possibilities of Ukrainian victory, but the long haul still favors Russia, simply because Russia is bigger, more resourced independently. It is not dependent on the same sorts of outside support. It has its own military industry that remains well ahead of Ukraine's, certainly in volume. And while Putin is walking a very, very thin line in terms of how much he can push the young male population of Russia to fight in Ukraine before resentment over this perhaps boils over. We're nowhere near that point yet. At least there's no evidence of it. So, Ukraine remains on the back foot. And it has been on the back foot through most of the past 3 years. And that's not looking very likely to change militarily unless the West, and at this point, that means Europe and not the United States, actually really joins in the war. As I have maintained elsewhere, the argument that that the United States needed to sort of hold back and not only not participate in the war, but also restrain Ukraine from launching offensive attacks into Russia. That whole thinking was based on the idea that Russia might use tactical nuclear weapons and escalate the fighting. The thing is, if Russia thinks it's going to lose, that's exactly what will happen. So that thinking as a strategy is self-defeating ultimately, because ultimately, if you want to win, you have to put Putin in the position where, you know, those sort of weapons of mass destruction are going to be the option that he turns to. So here we are, and we had, as I said earlier, we had the opportunity, I think, in late spring, early summer of 2022, to find a diplomatic resolution, which was never going to be just and right. The agreement that would have needed to be reached would have no doubt been very, very unpleasant compromises on Ukraine's part, because the reality is Russia is in occupation of 20% of Ukraine, and they have no real reason to get out. So they would have to be in some way convinced. And that means making concessions that Kyiv rightly does not want to make, but the realities of power will leave it no choice. That was not the course that the United States wanted to go down. As then Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made very clear, the American goal was not actually defending Ukraine, it was to degrade Russia. And that's what this was about. I personally believe that a lot of this the approach of the Biden administration towards this whole war was based on both degrading Russia, but also reinvigorating NATO after 4 years of Trump that had left NATO on the brink of collapse as an alliance. And I think Biden successfully used Ukraine to reinvigorate that alliance. Um, but that doesn't help the people of Ukraine because NATO is not going to be and has not been involved. NATO countries have delivered aid to Ukraine, but that's the extent of it. So we end up with Trump. And as I think many of us expected, whether we supported Biden's strategy or thought it was foolhardy, I think many of us expected that if Trump got back into office, um, the betrayal of Ukraine was not long to follow, and here we are. The plan that that the Trump administration has put forward is not a plan. It just isn't. It is a essentially a surrender at this point, and it need not have been. Some, and I think these are voices that are a bit more supportive of Russia, frankly, have argued that this is what peace would look like. And the terms are essentially that with minor adjustments here and there, Russia gets to keep the territory it is occupying, Crimea, the Donbass, the various oblasts that it is occupying in southern Ukraine, um, in exchange for some vague security guarantees that I think Trump believes will hold because there will be American interests in Ukraine that Russia would not want to threaten. That's, of course, the mineral deal that Trump has talked about at length. Um, if I'm a Ukrainian, that is not the security guarantee that I want to count on. Um, but that's the offer on the table, and I think it's obvious that no leader of any country could possibly even consider that kind of offer and expect to stay in office. Whether or not Trump realizes that, I don't know. I'm pretty sure Vladimir Putin realizes it, and therefore hopes very much that Volodymyr Zelensky will accept that offer. He's already rejected it, of course, and rejected it out of hand, and is right to do so. That doesn't mean that what we were going to end up with, if there was to be a ceasefire, wouldn't look like this. But they would probably need to be, well, first of all, NATO membership for Ukraine is not a realistic possibility. And I think people who argue for it, and I get the argument that, we just saw why NATO membership is so important to Ukraine, because Russia has just invaded Ukraine, which would be much more difficult, if not impossible, for it to do if Ukraine was a NATO member, because all NATO members would then be forced to respond. Um, on the other hand, I think that is something that I do understand. And I think if you stop and think about it for a minute, it's not hard to understand why that would be a red line for Russia. Um, Consider for a moment what the American reaction would be if Mexico, for example, and if we had a more fraught, let's say, relationship with Mexico than we do, and Mexico signed a pact with Russia or China, a serious U.S. rival, that was similar to the agreements of NATO. That was a military alliance that committed those superpowers to coming to Mexico's aid should there be an attack from the United States. I don't think the United States would stand for that. I think the United States would respond by invading Mexico, quite frankly. I think it would certainly be a bellwether towards a global conflict if something like that was to happen. I think we can look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, 60 plus years ago, to see what that would have looked like, and to see that the United States is not going to stand for those sorts of threats coming that close to its border. And I don't think it's reasonable for us to expect Russia to do so either. I also think the concern about Russia moving on from Ukraine and invading other European countries, given their abject failure in their initial invasion of Ukraine, and how they've managed to hold on to almost all the territory that they occupied um, in 2022 for 3 years now. I don't against again fighting only against Ukraine, with aid, of course, from the Europe and the United States and various countries, but no actual boots on the ground. Um, I think it tells you that there's not a chance that they could move beyond Ukraine and into Europe anywhere in the foreseeable future. So I don't think NATO membership is the must that other people think it is, but I do think it's the red line for Russia that he claims. And so I think eventually NATO membership, which should not have been brought up by George W. Bush, 18 years ago to begin with, uh, would have been something that we were going to have to say, yeah. I mean, that was going to be a concession that would have to be made, and that's something the United States and Europe and other NATO countries can say yes or no to. That's not a Ukrainian decision. What is a Ukrainian decision is the disposition of the Donbass, the Zaporizhia region, certainly Crimea, the areas that Russia is occupying. And that is not something that the United States can agree to, though we can support or oppose some proposal or other. Um, and I think if the United States had an idea and went to Ukraine about how to deal with that, I think Ukraine would listen. I think they'd have to. Not necessarily follow whatever the United States said, but I think they'd certainly have to, consider it. We've in fact, I think, seen that Zelensky has considered much more, frankly, unfair things that Trump has proposed, such as this mineral deal, um, that are extremely unfair. He considers them because he has no choice. There are power dynamics here that we can't just ignore. It's easy to talk about fighting to the end and all these wonderful slogans, but there are realities that have to be dealt with. The fact that there was going to have to be some sort of arrangement, and I think eventually it would have come out to something like kind of freezing things, some sort of arrangement like sort of like that Greece, like what Greece and Turkey came to over Cyprus. um uh the not deciding really the matter, leaving it sort of in this gray area. I think that would have been the best case scenario that we could have found, unless again the West is prepared to actually fight Russia. um and the West is not prepared to do that. Even Europe is not prepared to do this, although they, with the United States pulling out, it does seem like at least some of them are making some noises about, quote, boots on the ground. But we'll see whether or not that really materializes. The thing is, and this is the key point, any sort of agreements like that had to come with Russian concessions, major Russian concessions, things that could be verified, that could be monitored. You know, saying you have to allow an international presence uh, in these occupied oblasts, to both for monitoring human rights, especially considering the sort of cultural erasure that programs that Russia has embarked on there. Not to mention kidnapping of children and other major war crimes that have gone on. There would have had to have been agreements around these things, that offered some degree of measurable, enforceable security for Ukraine, and and a process put in place to continue to negotiate over the Russian occupation. The idea that there's an agreement here wherein Ukraine agrees to recognize Russia's sovereignty over Crimea, for example, is an utter non-starter. It's an utter non-starter, and why should they? It makes no sense whatsoever, and it undermines the entire concept, and a concept I think we really do need to fight much harder for than we have, that we do not permit the acquisition of territory by force. So the point here is that, yes, I have always supported diplomacy. I continue to. I don't see a military solution, and I don't see and if there's going to be a military outcome, I don't see it as being favorable to Ukraine, if that's where we go. Again, unless the West is willing to really fight Russia. And we still have seen no indication that it is. And if it's not, then the long-term conflict, and the military confrontation favors Russia, almost certainly. Yeah. Ukraine's the one that's getting devastated, not Russia. Russia has suffered some damage, but compared to what Ukraine's been through, it's been minimal. So, that continues over the long term. How do we really see Russia being defeated? I don't see it. So I do believe diplomacy is the answer, but diplomacy cannot mean that the mediator comes in and hands everything over to Russia without securing anything at all from Russia in terms of a concession. What has to happen is everything Trump has put on the table needs to be taken off, and there need to be real negotiations. Right now, Putin is refusing anything like that because why should he? Why should he do that when he knows he can get everything he wants by and give up almost nothing? Um, because that's what Trump is going to facilitate. That's the situation that we find ourselves in. So, how do we get out of it? I mean, I think, popular American pressure against what Trump is doing is one way, or at least one ingredient. But the key is going to be the international community, as it always is. Europe on this issue, unlike certain others that, that I tend to talk about quite a bit, in the Middle East, Europe has the interest and ability to do something here. And it looks like they may have realized that they will have to act in some forceful way. They need to provide the alternative. They need to say Trump's terms are unacceptable. That is not how this is going to go. And we are going to enable and enable Ukraine to fight with in much more advanced manner, more offensively against Russia, and we're going to help. I think Europe is starting to realize that's the only way that they can possibly move this forward. And I think also, a lot of people see China as being part of this equation in the sense that they support Russia because Russia's their ally, but they've never seemed all that enthusiastic about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And those that think that this is some parallel to China's situation in Taiwan, it's the two are very, very different. And I don't think China believes one way or the other that this sets a precedent for them in Taiwan. I don't think they're very happy that that comparison's even being drawn. So I think there could be paths where we've seen, and we have at times seen it, that China has seemed to sort of behind the scenes be urging Russia to take a more conciliatory stance. And I think if Europe manages to change the game, they might find that China is a bit more helpful than they think it will be. But that's, of course, unknowable until we get there. China is not exactly transparent about its thinking. Um, so that is the way forward. What cannot be tolerated is what Donald Trump is doing right now, which is basically selling the farm to Russia and Vladimir Putin. And I guess in the end, the bottom line is if Donald Trump says, "Well, take this or I'm walking away," I think the best thing that Ukraine can do is say, "Good, walk away." And let us talk to London. Let us talk to Brussels. Let us talk to Paris. Let us talk to Berlin. I think that is probably the only way that Ukraine has any hope right now. And I also think that there will be some fights on Capitol Hill about continuing to support Ukraine whether Trump likes it or not. I think there will be a push, and it may come to some degree from at least some parts of the Republican Party to at least continue sending some military aid, even if, the United States ends up taking a backseat. So that will that's where I still, and ultimately, my concern is that what Trump is doing is making diplomacy look even worse, because anyone who thinks this is diplomacy, well, they're mistaken. They're also giving diplomacy a really bad name. So please share this, like, and subscribe. Your feedback is welcome. Um, and if you can support this work, please go to mitchellplutnik.substack.com and do so. Thanks very much. Talk to you soon.